The old oak tree in Robert Chambers' backyard had been there long before anyone could remember. Standing nearly 60 feet tall with a trunk so wide that Robert couldn't wrap his arms even halfway around it, the tree was the pride of Seawind Lane. Robert, a retired postal worker with salt and pepper hair and hands that showed years of honest work, hadn't chosen the house because of the tree 15 years ago, but it had quickly become the reason he could never imagine leaving. That oak's got to be at least 300 years old. Bill Henderson from next door had told him shortly after he moved in. My grandpa used to say it was already the biggest tree in the county when he was a boy. And that man was born in 1903. Robert had smiled at that, feeling somehow honored to be living on the same plot of land as such an ancient living thing. Over the years, he'd learned more about the tree from local tree experts, history buffs, and old-timers who'd stop by just to sit in its shade on hot summer days. The coastal town of Bridgeport, North Carolina, wasn't large, just under 5,000 people, but the tree had become something of an unofficial landmark. School kids sometimes came on field trips to measure its circumference for science class. Couples had taken engagement photos beneath its sprawling branches. And every Christmas, Robert strung lights along its lower limbs, creating a warm glow that could be seen from 3 blocks away. "You've got yourself a guardian there, Mrs. Patterson," a white-haired woman who ran the local library had once told him. Trees like that, they watch over places. Native Americans believed old oaks held the spirits of ancestors. Whether or not that was true, Robert couldn't say, but he did feel a certain peace whenever he sat on the wooden bench he'd placed beneath the tree's massive canopy. Sometimes in the evening, he'd bring out a glass of iced tea and just listen to the wind rustling through thousands of leaves overhead, a sound like gentle waves breaking on the shore. "I'm just its caretaker for now," Robert often told visitors who admired the tree. "It was here long before me, and if I do right by it, it'll be here long after I'm gone." He took that responsibility seriously. Every spring, he had an arborist check the tree's health. During dry spells, he'd run a soaker hose around its base, making sure the roots got enough water. When a lightning storm was forecast, he'd find himself lying awake, listening to the thunder and hoping the oak would be spared. The tree had its own personality, or so Robert liked to think. In spring, it was the last on the block to leaf out, as if cautiously testing whether winter was truly gone. By midsummer, its canopy was so dense that even during the heaviest downpours, the ground beneath stayed almost dry. And in fall, it held onto its leaves well into November, dropping them all at once during the first real cold snap, carpeting the yard in russet and gold overnight. Over the 15 years Robert had lived there, the tree had become more than just a feature of his property. It was a companion of sorts. His daughter Lily had hung a tire swing from one of the lower branches when his grandkids were younger. Now teenagers, they still climbed up to the wooden platform Robert had built, 10 feet up the trunk, where they could sit and talk about things they wouldn't share with adults. The oak had seen Bridgeport change over the centuries. What was once likely Native American hunting grounds had become colonial farmland, then a small fishing village, and eventually the modest coastal town it was today. The tree had weathered countless storms, droughts, and whatever else 3 centuries could throw at it. Some of the older branches bore the scars of long-ago lightning strikes, and the trunk had a peculiar twist about 20 feet up that the arborist said probably happened during some forgotten hurricane 100 years back. Trees like this, they're survivors, the arborist had told Robert during last year's checkup. They bend but don't break. That's how they get to be so old. The community had come to see the oak as part of their shared heritage. When a developer had approached Robert 5 years ago, offering well above market value for his property with plans to build townhouses, neighbors had organized a petition to create a local ordinance protecting significant trees. The oak was the first to be designated under the new rule. "You couldn't pay me enough anyway," Robert had told the developer. "Some things are worth more than money." The local paper had run a small story about it, calling Robert the oak's advocate. He'd kept the clipping, though he felt a bit embarrassed by the attention. To his mind, he wasn't doing anything special, just honoring something that deserved respect. Robert's late wife, Helen, had loved the tree as much as he did. Before cancer took her 8 years ago, they'd often sit together beneath its branches on summer evenings, talking about everything and nothing as the fireflies came out. After she passed, he'd scattered some of her ashes among the roots, a private goodbye that somehow felt right. Sometimes, especially at dusk when the light filtered through the leaves just so, He felt she was still there with him. The oak had a way of bringing people together. Robert's neighbor Tom, a quiet man who rarely socialized, would sometimes wander over when Robert was in the yard. "Tree's looking good," he'd say, which was his way of starting a conversation that might last an hour, ranging from baseball to politics to the rising cost of living. The oak gave people a reason to connect, an excuse to linger. Children in the neighborhood called it the climbing tree, though Robert only allowed supervised visits after a youngster had fallen and broken an arm a few years back. He'd built a small wooden sign that read, "The Guardian Oak, 300+ years and counting," and placed it at the edge of his property so passers-by could appreciate the tree's significance. Local wildlife considered the oak their domain as well. Squirrels chased each other in spiraling paths up and down the trunk. A family of cardinals returned each year to nest in the upper branches. Woodpeckers visited regularly, though Robert discouraged them with shiny ribbons tied to nearby branches. He didn't mind sharing the tree, but he drew the line at holes being drilled into its bark. Over time, Robert had collected acorns from the oak and grown several saplings in pots on his back porch. He'd given them away to friends and family, a way of spreading the tree's legacy. His daughter had planted one in her yard 2 towns over. His brother had another at his lake house upstate. The tree was creating a family of its own. "You know, they say the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago," Robert told his oldest grandson last summer. "Second best time is today, but we're lucky. Somebody planted this one 300 years ago thinking about the future." That's a kind of hope, isn't it? The Weather Channel had been talking about hurricane season for weeks now, predicting an active year. Robert had lived through plenty of storms on the Carolina coast, and the oak had weathered far more. Still, as he watched the forecast tracking Hurricane Eleanor's path toward the shoreline, he felt an unfamiliar twinge of worry. "It'll be fine," he told himself, as he stocked up on bottled water and batteries. "That tree's seen worse than whatever's coming." The oak had always been there, a constant in a changing world. Robert couldn't imagine his property without it towering above the roofline, its massive shadow cooling the yard on hot days, its roots running deep into soil that held centuries of stories. The tree wasn't just part of his property, it was part of who he was now, part of the legacy he'd leave behind someday. As the weather reports grew more urgent and the sky to the east darkened with approaching clouds, Robert found himself standing at his back window, looking out at the oak. Its leaves rustled in the strengthening breeze, a whispered conversation he couldn't quite make out. For the first time since he'd moved in, he wondered if perhaps the old guardian had finally met a storm it couldn't withstand. "We'll get through this together, old friend," he said softly, pressing his palm against the cool glass of the window, "just like we always do." Little did he know that Hurricane Eleanor would change everything, revealing secrets that had been waiting patiently beneath the oak's roots for generations, secrets that would soon have the whole neighborhood talking. The weather reports had been warning about Hurricane Eleanor for days, but like many storms before, Robert had hoped it would veer off into the Atlantic and spare the coastline. By Wednesday morning, that hope had vanished. The local news showed satellite images of the massive storm, a swirling giant larger than the state itself, bearing down on the Carolina coast with winds already reaching 110 miles per hour. They were upgrading it to a Category 3. "This is the big one, folks," the weatherman said, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced with serious concern. "If you're in a low-lying area or mobile home, evacuation is mandatory. Everyone else should be prepared for extended power outages and significant damage." Robert's neighborhood wasn't in the evacuation zone. They were about 2 miles inland, and on slightly higher ground than the beachfront properties. Still, as he taped up his windows and brought in anything from the yard that could become a projectile, he couldn't help glancing up at the oak tree every few minutes. "You've weathered worse," he said aloud to the tree, though doubt crept into his voice. His neighbor Bill stopped by around noon, his truck already packed with essentials. "You heading out, Robert?" "My sister's place in Raleigh has plenty of room." Robert shook his head. "House has been through plenty of storms. I'd rather be here to deal with any problems right away." What he didn't say was that he couldn't bear the thought of the oak facing Eleanor alone. Foolish as it might seem to others, he felt a duty to stay. "Well, don't be a hero," Bill clapped him on the shoulder. "If they call for last-minute evacuations, you promise you'll go?" Robert nodded, though they both knew he probably wouldn't. By late afternoon, the sky had turned an eerie yellowish gray. The air felt heavy, like holding your breath underwater, and the temperature had dropped suddenly, sending a chill through the increasingly deserted streets. The wind came in gusts now, strong enough to make Robert stagger as he made one final check of his property. Standing beneath the oak, he looked up at its massive canopy. The leaves were turning upward, showing their silvery undersides, an old sign his grandfather had taught him meant rain was coming. He placed his hand on the rough bark of the trunk, feeling the solidity of it, the permanence. 300 years, he murmured. You've seen it all, haven't you? Inside, Robert filled his bathtub with water, charged his phone, and set out flashlights, batteries, and non-perishable food on the kitchen counter. The power was still on, so he made a pot of coffee and turned on the TV for as long as he'd have reception. The weather radar showed the hurricane's eye would pass almost directly over Bridgeport sometime after midnight. By 8 o'clock, the storm had announced itself fully. The wind no longer came in gusts but howled continuously, a high-pitched wailing that seemed to search for any tiny gap in the house's defenses. Rain lashed against the windows horizontally, not falling so much as being hurled from the sky. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. Robert lit a couple of candles and settled into his armchair in the living room, away from the windows, with a battery-powered radio keeping him company. The local station had switched to continuous emergency broadcasting, sharing reports of flooding in neighboring towns and roofs torn from buildings along the coast. Wind speeds now exceeding 120 miles per hour, the broadcaster announced, voice tight with controlled concern. All residents should be in their safe rooms, away from windows and exterior walls if possible. The house creaked and groaned around him, shifting slightly with each powerful gust. Robert had never heard it make such sounds before, as if the very framework was crying out in protest. Outside, smaller branches and debris clattered against the siding like thrown pebbles. Around 10:30, the storm seemed to reach a new intensity. The noise was so loud that Robert could hardly hear himself think. The windows vibrated in their frames, and he began to worry they might shatter despite the tape. He decided it was time to move to the basement, which was built partly into the ground and offered the most protection. He grabbed his emergency bag, a flashlight, and the small wooden box of Helen's mementos he always kept nearby in case of fire. As he made his way toward the basement door off the kitchen, a sound cut through even the howling wind, a high, tortured creaking that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. Robert froze, instantly knowing what it was. The oak. Instinctively, he turned toward the back of the house, toward the tree, though he couldn't see anything through the darkness and rain-lashed windows. The creaking came again, louder this time, accompanied by a series of pops and cracks like gunshots. No, 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 he whispered. Then came a sound he would never forget, a tremendous rending tear that seemed to go on forever, followed by a boom that shook the entire house when it hit the ground. The floor beneath his feet actually trembled from the impact. The guardian oak had fallen. Robert stood there in shock, flashlight beam trembling in his hand. For a moment he forgot about his own safety, about the hurricane still raging outside. All he could think was that a living thing that had stood watch for 3 centuries was gone in an instant. The house shuddered again as another powerful gust hit. A crash from upstairs snapped Robert back to reality, likely a window giving way. He hurried down to the basement, forcing himself to focus on surviving the night. There would be time to mourn the tree later. The basement was small but solid, with concrete walls and a few narrow windows near the ceiling that Robert had boarded up earlier. He set up a cot in the corner furthest from the windows, arranged his supplies, and sat listening to the storm rage on. The radio signal was spotty now, but he could still catch fragments of emergency broadcasts between bursts of static. Despite his exhaustion, sleep was impossible. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the oak as it had been that morning, proud and seemingly indestructible. Now it was gone just like that. He wondered where exactly it had fallen, whether it had damaged the house or the shed, whether its massive root system had torn up his entire yard. But those were practical concerns for tomorrow. Tonight, what he felt was a sense of loss deeper than seemed reasonable for a tree. It wasn't just a tree, he said aloud to the empty basement. Around 3 in the morning, the wind began to ease somewhat. The eye of the hurricane had passed, and while the storm was far from over, the worst had moved inland. Robert must have dozed off eventually because he woke with a start, as sunlight filtered through the cracks in the boards over the basement windows. For a moment, he wasn't sure where he was or why he was sleeping on a cot in the basement. Then it all came rushing back, the hurricane, the terrible sound of the oak falling. He checked his watch. 6:45 a.m. Moving stiffly, he gathered his flashlight and made his way upstairs. The house was a mess. Water had seeped in from somewhere, leaving puddles on the kitchen floor. A window in the guest bedroom had broken despite the tape, allowing rain to soak the carpet and curtains. But the structure itself seemed intact. Robert was almost afraid to look out back, to confirm what he already knew. Finally, steeling himself, he walked to the kitchen and peered through the window that overlooked the backyard. The scene took his breath away. The massive oak lay across the yard like a fallen giant. Its trunk had snapped about 6 feet up from the base, leaving a jagged, splintered wound pointing skyward. The upper portion of the tree had crashed through his back fence and extended well into his neighbor's yard. Branches splayed out in all directions. But what truly stunned Robert was the sight of the root system. Torn entirely from the ground, it created a wall of earth and tangled roots reaching 15 feet into the air. The crater left behind was like nothing he'd ever seen, a massive hole in the earth where the heart of the tree had been anchored for centuries. Robert stood at the window for a long time, taking in the magnitude of the destruction. Birds were already returning, hopping curiously among the fallen branches, exploring their new reality. The rain had stopped completely, though the sky remained overcast. In the distance, he could hear the wail of emergency sirens. When he finally opened his back door and stepped onto the porch, the smell hit him immediately. Fresh earth, wet wood, and something else. Something old that had been buried and was now exposed to air for the first time in who knew how long. The root ball of the oak was a tangle of thick wooden tentacles, caked with dark soil and stones. Water pooled in the crater, already forming a small pond where the roots had been. As Robert made his way carefully across the debris-strewn yard toward the fallen giant, he felt like he was approaching the body of an old friend. He placed his hand on the massive trunk, still solid, still alive in some sense, though it would never stand tall again. The wood was warm beneath his palm. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though he knew it wasn't his fault. Nature had simply, finally, won a battle 300 years in the making. As he walked around to look at the massive root ball, something caught his eye. Something that didn't belong among the earth and tangled roots. Something that glinted in the weak morning light. Robert moved closer, curiosity momentarily overriding his grief. There, half buried in the wall of earth pulled up by the oak's roots, was what looked like the corner of a metal box. Robert stood perfectly still, staring at the glint of metal peeking through the dirt. For a moment, the devastation of the fallen oak was forgotten as curiosity took hold. He moved closer, careful of his footing on the uneven ground. The massive root system of the oak had been ripped from the earth like a giant hand had yanked it skyward, leaving a crater nearly 6 feet deep and twice as wide. The tangled roots formed a wall of wood and soil that towered over Robert, some of the thicker roots as big around as his thigh. Water was already pooling in the bottom of the hole, reflecting the gray morning sky. But it was the corner of what appeared to be a box that held his attention. It was wedged between two large roots, partially exposed where the soil had fallen away. The metal was dark with age but unmistakably man-made, its corner forming a perfect right angle that nature rarely created on its own. "Well, I'll be," Robert muttered to himself. He glanced back at his house, considering whether he should get some tools, but impatience won out. Using his hands, he began carefully scraping away the damp soil surrounding the object. As more of it was revealed, he could see it was definitely a box, rectangular and about the size of a thick hardcover book. It was made of metal, though what type was hard to tell beneath the coating of dirt and apparent corrosion. "How long have you been down there?" Robert wondered aloud as he worked. The thought that this object had been buried beneath the oak was mind-boggling. If the tree was 300 years old, this box could have been placed there any time during those centuries. The soil was heavy and clay-like, making the work slow. Robert's fingers became caked with mud as he dug around the edges of the box. One of the roots had grown alongside it, almost cradling the object, which made extraction difficult. He pulled a pocket knife from his jeans and carefully cut away at the smaller root fibers that had grown around the box. After nearly 20 minutes of digging and maneuvering, the box finally came free with a soft, wet sound, like a boot being pulled from deep mud. Robert sat back on his heels, breathing hard from the effort, the box now resting in his mud-covered hands. It was heavier than he'd expected. He wiped away some of the dirt to get a better look. The metal appeared to be some kind of old tin or possibly steel, with spots of rust but still remarkably intact, considering how long it must have been underground. Most interestingly, there appeared to be a simple latch mechanism on one side, suggesting it was meant to be opened. Robert looked up at the sky. The clouds were breaking apart now, allowing patches of blue to show through. The storm had passed, but the damage remained. All around the neighborhood, he could hear people emerging from their homes, calling out to check on one another, the occasional sound of a chainsaw already buzzing in the distance as cleanup began. He should really see what damage the house had sustained, check on his neighbors, call his daughter to let her know he was okay, but the mystery in his hands was too compelling to set aside. Carrying the box carefully, Robert made his way back to his porch, avoiding fallen branches and debris. He settled on the steps, which were mostly dry thanks to the porch overhang, and placed the box between his feet. Using the hem of his shirt, he wiped away more of the soil, revealing what looked like a pattern etched into the metal lid, though it was too encrusted with dirt to make out clearly. The latch was stuck fast, either from corrosion or the pressure of soil that had surrounded it for so long. Robert worked at it gently with his knife tip, not wanting to damage whatever might be inside. After several careful attempts, he felt something give, and with a soft click, the latch released. For a moment, Robert just stared at the box, his heart beating a little faster. There was something almost sacred about opening something that had been sealed away for who knew how long. He took a deep breath and slowly lifted the lid. The first thing he noticed was that the inside of the box was perfectly dry. Whatever material had been used to seal it had done its job remarkably well over the years. The second thing he noticed was the smell. Old paper and leather with hints of something metallic. Inside, neatly arranged, were several items. On top was what appeared to be a folded piece of fabric, faded but still showing hints of a grayish-blue color. Robert lifted it carefully, realizing it was a small bundle wrapped around something solid. As he unfolded the cloth, several small metal buttons tumbled into his palm. Brass buttons embossed with what looked like a letter C surrounded by a wreath design. "Confederate," Robert whispered, suddenly understanding what he was looking at. The fabric was likely a piece of a Confederate uniform, and the buttons had once been attached to it. The Civil War had raged through these parts in the early 1860s. Could this box really have been buried for more than 160 years? Setting the buttons and fabric aside carefully, Robert turned his attention back to the box. Beneath where the uniform piece had been lay several coins. He picked one up, turning it in the strengthening sunlight. It was a gold coin, about the size of a modern quarter but thicker and heavier. The face showed the profile of a woman with the word Liberty above it, and the back displayed an eagle with spread wings. Around the edge was the inscription, "United States of America," and the date, 1857. "Gold dollars," Robert breathed, picking up another. There were 7 coins in total, each one a small fortune in today's terms, not just for their gold content but for their historical value. Beneath the coins was a folded piece of paper that had turned yellow with age. Robert opened it with extreme care, afraid it might crumble in his hands. It was a handwritten letter, the ink faded to a soft brown but still legible. The handwriting was elegant with graceful loops and flourishes that spoke of an education in penmanship that few people received nowadays. "My dearest Thomas," it began. Robert scanned the contents quickly. It was a love letter from someone named Elizabeth to a man called Thomas Merritt. She wrote of her worries for his safety as he went off to fight, her hopes for his quick return, and her prayers for the conflict to end soon. The letter was dated April 18, 1862, but the most significant item in the box, taking up most of its space, was a leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked with age but had been protected from the elements by the sealed metal container. A thin leather strap was wrapped around it, keeping it closed. With gentle fingers, Robert unwound the strap and opened the journal. On the inside cover, written in the same careful hand as the letter, was the name Private Thomas Merritt, Company B, 18th North Carolina Infantry, Army of Northern Virginia. The pages were filled with neat, tight handwriting, recording dates and events from what appeared to be Thomas Merritt's time as a Confederate soldier. Robert flipped through carefully, catching glimpses of battles, long marches, and personal reflections on the war. The final entry was dated June 29, 1862. "Tomorrow we march to a place called Malvern Hill," the entry read. "The men say it will be the decisive battle that drives the Yankees back for good. I pray it is so, as I long to return home to Elizabeth and to peace. I have buried my few valuables near the old oak on my father's land, along with this account of my service. Should I not return, may whoever finds this remember that I fought not for slavery, which I have never supported, but for my home and family, as any man would." Robert sat back, overwhelmed by what he was reading. This journal was a direct connection to someone who had lived and died more than a century and a half ago. The oak tree that had stood in Robert's yard had been a landmark for Thomas Merritt, too, a place he knew well enough to trust with his possessions before heading into a battle he feared he might not survive. And apparently, he never did come back to retrieve them. Robert carefully returned the journal to the box and closed the lid, his mind racing. The historian in him, a hobby he'd picked up in retirement, knew he was holding something of significant historical value. These weren't just old trinkets. They were artifacts that told a personal story from one of the most tumultuous periods in American history. The fallen oak suddenly took on a new dimension in Robert's mind. It hadn't just been a beautiful old tree. It had been a silent guardian, protecting Thomas Merritt's legacy for generations until the hurricane had finally exposed it to the light of day. As Robert sat on his porch steps, cradling the box that connected him to a man who had walked this very land during the Civil War, the loss of the oak didn't hurt quite as much. The tree might be gone, but it had left him with an unexpected gift, a direct connection to the past and a story that had waited more than 160 years to be told. In the distance, Robert could hear his neighbors calling to each other, the community already coming together to begin the long process of recovery from the hurricane. Soon he would join them, but first he needed to examine the rest of the contents of Thomas Merritt's box, to handle with care the treasures that had been entrusted to the oak so long ago. The morning after Hurricane Eleanor hit Bridgeport was a blur of activity as neighbors emerged from their homes to assess the damage. Power lines were down across much of the town, cell service was spotty at best, and the sound of chainsaws and generators filled the air. Despite the destruction, there was an unspoken sense of relief. They had weathered the worst storm to hit the coast in decades, and they were still standing. Robert had carefully wrapped Thomas Merritt's box in a clean towel and placed it on his kitchen table. After a quick check of his house, finding a few leaks but no major structural damage, he set out to see if his neighbors needed help. The community had always pulled together after storms, and this would be no different. Bill Henderson was already out front, dragging tree limbs to the curb. He waved when he saw Robert approaching. "Your oak went down, huh?" he called. "Saw it from my window this morning. Shame about that beautiful tree." Robert nodded, still processing the loss. "Yeah, heard it go down right in the middle of the storm. Sounded like the world was ending." "Least it didn't hit your house," Bill said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "The Thompsons weren't so lucky. Big Pine came right through their sunroom." They chatted a few more minutes about the damage around the neighborhood. Robert helped Bill move a particularly heavy branch, then continued down the street, stopping to check on elderly Mrs. Wilson and the young couple who had just moved in 2 doors down. Throughout the morning, Robert found his thoughts returning to the box and its contents. He wanted to share his discovery, but wasn't sure how to bring it up without sounding like he was trying to draw attention away from the hurricane recovery efforts. The timing felt wrong somehow. That decision was made for him when he returned home around noon to find his next-door neighbor, Pete Collins, standing in his backyard staring at the fallen oak. "Hope you don't mind," Pete called as Robert approached. "Just wanted to see this old giant up close now that she's down." Pete was a high school history teacher who had moved in about 5 years ago. He and Robert had bonded over their shared interest in Civil War history, often trading books and discussing documentaries they'd watched. "Not at all," Robert said, joining him beside the massive trunk. "Hard to believe it's actually gone." Pete shook his head in wonder. "Look at that root system. Must go down 15-20 feet. No wonder it stood for centuries." He pointed to the crater left behind. "That's going to be some hole to fill." Robert hesitated only a moment before saying, "Actually, I found something when the tree came down. Something that was buried under it." Pete's eyebrows shot up. Found something?
Like what?
It's easier if I show you, Robert said. Back in the kitchen, Robert carefully unwrapped the metal box and watched as Pete's expression changed from curiosity to astonishment. Are those Confederate uniform buttons? Pete asked, leaning close to examine them without touching. His hands hovered above the items, trembling slightly with excitement. Robert nodded, explaining how he'd found the box and showing Pete the journal, the coins and the letter. Pete sat back in his chair, shaking his head in disbelief.
Robert, do you realize what you found?
This is an incredible historical artifact. Primary source material from a Confederate soldier, preserved perfectly. This is the kind of thing museums dream about. So you think it's authentic? Robert asked. The buttons alone look period correct. And that journal? Pete's eyes were wide. The 18th North Carolina was definitely at Malvern Hill. It was part of the 7 days battles near Richmond in 1862. Heavy casualties. He paused, looking at Robert seriously. You need to get these authenticated properly. I know someone at the County Historical Society who could help. By the afternoon, Pete had made a few calls on his still-working landline, and Dr. Gwen Howard from the North Carolina Coastal Historical Society had agreed to come by the next day to look at the items. Pete could barely contain his excitement, pacing Robert's living room and talking about the historical significance of the find. Do you mind if I tell a few people about this? Pete asked. I think it might give folks something positive to focus on amid all this storm damage. Robert agreed, and by evening the first curious neighbors began appearing at his door. In a community where most people still had no power or internet, news traveled remarkably fast by word of mouth. Mrs. Wilson brought over a homemade pie despite having a tree limb through her front porch. The Thompsons took a break from covering the hole in their roof to stop by. Even the mayor, who lived 3 streets over, found time between emergency response meetings to come see the Civil War treasure everyone was talking about. Robert set up a small display on his dining room table, carefully arranging the items from the box where people could see them without handling them. He kept the journal in the center, open to Thomas Merritt's final entry. Imagine, the mayor said, reading the page. He wrote this not knowing if he'd ever come home again. And he never did. Do we know what happened to him? Asked Louise Parker, who ran the local library. To this Thomas Merritt? Pete had been researching using a history book he kept in his car. From what I can find, the 18th North Carolina took heavy casualties at Malvern Hill. It was a brutal battle, the last of the 7 days campaign. The regiment lost about 1/3 of its men. And Elizabeth? Mrs. Wilson asked, referring to the woman who had written the love letter. What became of her? No one knew, and that mystery only added to the intrigue surrounding the discovery. As evening approached, Robert's house had become an impromptu gathering place for the neighborhood. Someone had brought a gas grill from their backyard, and a community cookout began as people shared whatever perishable food was going to spoil without refrigeration. Flashlights and battery-powered lanterns illuminated the yard as darkness fell. The next morning brought more visitors, including a reporter from the local newspaper who had heard about the find. She took photos of the items and interviewed Robert about how he had discovered the box. It's like the oak was protecting it all these years, Robert told her, waiting for the right time. By afternoon, Dr. Howard arrived from the Historical Society, bringing with her archival gloves and acid-free containers to properly store the items. She examined each piece carefully, making notes and occasionally taking photos. The journal is extraordinary, she said, turning the pages with gloved hands, not just for its personal account of a soldier's experience, but because it mentions specific movements of the 18th North Carolina that align perfectly with official records. She confirmed that the buttons were indeed from a Confederate uniform, and the coins were genuine gold dollars from the 1850s, worth considerably more now than their face value. But the real value here is historical, not monetary, she explained to the small crowd that had gathered in Robert's living room. This is a perfectly preserved time capsule from one of the most pivotal periods in American history. When she finished her examination, Dr. Howard looked up at Robert. Mr. Chambers, the Historical Society would be very interested in these items. They really should be preserved professionally and made accessible to researchers and the public. Would you consider donating them? Robert thought about it. Part of him had grown attached to the box and its contents, feeling a strange connection to Thomas Merritt. But he also recognized that these artifacts didn't really belong to him. They were part of a shared history that deserved to be seen. "I'd like to keep the journal if possible," Robert said after a moment. "At least for a while. But the rest should go where they can be properly cared for and seen by more people than just my neighbors." Dr. Howard smiled. "I think we can work something out. We could digitize the journal so researchers could still access its contents, and perhaps do a special exhibition on Thomas Merritt and the oak tree that guarded his possessions for more than a century and a half." Word of the discovery had spread beyond Bridgeport now. A TV news crew from the nearest city arrived just as the sun was setting up their camera equipment in Robert's yard with the fallen oak as a backdrop. The reporter, a young woman with a bright smile, interviewed Robert while neighbors watched from the sidelines. In the midst of destruction brought by Hurricane Eleanor, one community has found an unexpected silver lining, she began her report, a piece of history preserved by nature and uncovered by the storm. As Robert watched the news crew pack up, he felt a strange mix of emotions. The loss of the oak still hurt, but its fall had connected him and the whole neighborhood to a piece of history none of them had known was literally right beneath their feet all along. In some ways, the old guardian was still bringing people together, even in death. 2 months after Hurricane Eleanor, life in Bridgeport had found a new normal. Blue tarps still covered some roofs waiting for repair, and piles of debris lingered on a few streets. But the initial crisis had passed. Power had been restored, businesses had reopened, and the community was healing, changed but moving forward. For Robert, these months had been unlike any in his life. The fallen oak that had dominated his backyard for so long was gone, but its absence had opened space for something new, not just physically, but in Robert's life as well. The County Historical Society had worked with Robert to create an exhibition called The Guardian Oak, a Civil War Soldier's Legacy. Most of the items from the metal box were now displayed in glass cases in the small museum downtown, carefully preserved and protected. Each weekend, visitors from surrounding towns and even a few from out of state came to see the artifacts and learn about Thomas Merritt. As promised, Robert had kept the journal, though he had allowed it to be professionally cleaned, digitized and bound in an acid-free protective cover. He'd spent countless hours poring over its pages, getting to know the young soldier who had buried his possessions beneath the oak all those years ago through research at the Historical Society and with help from a genealogist who had read about the discovery online. They had managed to piece together much of Thomas Merritt's story. He had indeed died at the Battle of Malvern Hill on July 1, 1862, just days after writing his final journal entry. Records showed he had been the son of a small farmer, whose land had included what was now Robert's property, and several surrounding blocks of the neighborhood. Most surprising had been the discovery of what happened to Elizabeth, the woman who had written the love letter. She had never married after learning of Thomas's death, instead becoming a schoolteacher and living a long life in the same county. She had died in 1916 at the age of 76, having outlived her sweetheart by more than half a century. She stayed true to him her whole life, Mrs. Wilson had said, wiping away a tear when they learned this detail. Now that's a love story. The Historical Society had created a small display about Elizabeth alongside Thomas's artifacts, including a photograph of her as an elderly woman that a distant relative had contributed after hearing about the exhibition. In the faded image, she sat straight-backed in a high-collared dress, her face lined with age, but her eyes still bright and alert. Robert often wondered if she had known that Thomas's possessions lay buried beneath the oak tree, waiting to be found. As for the oak itself, Robert couldn't bear the thought of it being cut up for firewood or hauled away as debris. The tree had been too important, both to him and now to history. Instead, he had contacted a local woodworker named Phil, who specialized in creating furniture and art from salvaged wood. "This is gorgeous timber," Phil had said, running his hand over the massive trunk. "Old-growth oak like this doesn't exist anymore. It would be a crime to waste it." Together, they had come up with a plan. The largest section of the trunk was carefully cut and transported to Phil's workshop, where it would become a series of benches for the Historical Society's garden. Smaller sections were set aside for special projects. One of these projects now sat in Robert's living room, a beautifully crafted display case made from the oak's wood. designed specifically to house Thomas Merritt's journal. Phil had incorporated one of the tree's natural knots into the design, and the grain of the wood seemed to tell its own story in swirls and lines that had taken centuries to form. The roots of the tree had been the hardest to deal with. Eventually, with help from neighbors and a small excavator donated for a day by a local construction company, Robert had managed to remove the massive root ball. The crater left behind had been filled and leveled, though it would be years before grass grew normally there. Robert's daughter Lily had suggested planting a new tree in the backyard, though not in exactly the same spot. It won't be the same as the oak, she had said during one of her visits to help with cleanup, but it could be something new for the next generation. After much consideration, Robert had chosen an American chestnut sapling, a species that had once been common throughout the eastern forests before blight had nearly wiped them out in the early 1900s. This particular sapling was from a blight-resistant strain developed by university researchers trying to restore the species to its former glory. "It'll be your comeback story," Robert had told the small tree as he carefully planted it on the opposite side of the yard from where the oak had stood. Just like the neighborhood. The most unexpected development had come 6 weeks after the hurricane, when Robert received a letter from a woman in Oregon named Beth Merritt Collins. She had seen a news story about the discovery online and realized she might be a distant relative of Thomas Merritt. "My family has roots in North Carolina going back generations," she had written. "My great-great-grandfather often mentioned a relative who died in the Civil War, but we never knew much about him. I think Thomas might be my great-great-granduncle." After several emails and phone calls, plus some DNA testing through a genealogy website, it was confirmed. Beth was indeed Thomas Merritt's direct descendant through his younger brother, who had been just a boy when Thomas marched off to war. Last week, Beth and her teenage son had flown across the country to visit Bridgeport and see the exhibition. Robert had given them a personal tour, showing them the artifacts and sharing stories from the journal. Beth's son, a quiet boy who had initially seemed bored by the prospect of a history museum, had become transfixed when he saw Thomas's handwriting. "That's my actual relative from the 1800s, he had whispered, pressing his hand against the display glass. Like my actual blood, the connection between past and present had never felt more real to Robert than in that moment. Yesterday had been another milestone, the dedication ceremony for the new bench at the Historical Society, crafted from the oak's wood. A small brass plaque on the bench read, "The Guardian Oak, Seal 1720-2025, witness to history and protector of Private Thomas Merritt's legacy." The mayor had made a short speech about resilience and memory, about how communities are shaped by both natural and human history. When he finished, people had lined up to run their hands over the smooth wooden bench, touching a piece of the tree that had been part of their town's landscape for so long. As twilight approached and the crowd dispersed, Robert had remained seated on the bench, feeling the familiar grain of the oak beneath his fingers. Dr. Howard from the Historical Society sat down beside him. "You know," she said after a comfortable silence, "when I first heard about your find, I thought the most valuable thing was the historical artifacts. The buttons, the coins, the journal, and they are incredibly important. But the more I think about it, the more I realize the most valuable thing we found was the connection." "Connection?" Robert asked, "between Thomas and us? Between his time and ours? Between neighbors who came together after the storm?" She smiled. "That oak tree connected it all. The roots literally held onto a piece of history until exactly the right moment for it to be found." Robert nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. He had been thinking much the same thing. This morning, back in his yard, Robert had spent some time with his new chestnut sapling. It was barely 5 feet tall with leaves that glowed golden in the autumn sunlight. Nothing like the massive presence the oak had been. "You've got big roots to fill," he told it, patting the slender trunk gently, "but you've got time. That's the thing about trees, they teach us to think in centuries, not minutes." From his pocket, he took a small object, one of the acorns he had collected from the oak years ago and kept in a jar on his windowsill. He had asked the Historical Society if he could plant some of the oak's descendants around town, and they had enthusiastically agreed. As he pressed the acorn into the soil a few feet from the chestnut, Robert thought about Thomas Merritt burying his box, and about how the simple act of placing something in the earth could connect people across time. One day, long after he was gone, another oak might stand here carrying on the legacy of its parent tree. And perhaps someone else would sit beneath its branches, feeling the same sense of peace and continuity that Robert had always felt with his guardian oak. The hurricane had taken something precious, but it had given something valuable in return, a reminder that even the things we think are permanent are actually just holding space in a much longer story. The oak was gone, but its story continued, branching out in new directions, putting down fresh roots, growing in ways no one could have predicted, just like life itself.